Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. This morning we're going to look at Isaiah chapters 13 through 16, the same ones we looked at in the class. But I want to take a little bit different picture this time. The class we look at some very granular level stuff. We look at individual verses and themes that are going through those verses. This morning I wanted to back up, and if you'll recognize the next slide because it's from the video that I just did, that I just showed during class. But I want us to think about the big level, higher level themes that are going on here. So this next section of Isaiah, verses 13 all the way through about 24, 25, is about trust. And this next section is about trusting man versus trusting God. And there's going to be a whole list of nations that are going to be listed, and they're here on this map also. If you want to look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire, by the time Tilgath-Pileser takes over, he's consolidated power. He's really made, for the first time, an empire out of Assyria. And Ahaz is scared of him, but he's even more scared of Israel and Syria to his immediate north, who have formed an alliance and are now threatening him. And God sees this test of Ahaz, and in chapter 7, let's look in Isaiah chapter 7. Let's just back up for a little bit and see what the test is for Ahaz. In Isaiah chapter 7, verse 5, because Syria with Ephraim was another name for Israel. Northern Ephraim was the largest tribe within the 10-tribe coalition up there. Because Syria and Ephraim with the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it. Let us conquer it for ourselves and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, and it shall not come to pass. For the head of Syria is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin, and within 65 years Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. Not just like, oh, they're going to have a military defeat. This is shattered from being a people, and the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. This is now to Ahaz he's talking here. Isaiah says that if you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all. So another way to say that might be, if you don't stand firm, you won't stand at all. There's some Hebrew poetic things going on here that it would be hard to explain in 5 minutes. But the same verb is being used twice. One is saying, if you don't stand, you won't stand. If you aren't firm in your faith that God is going to make these things happen, you will not be firm at all. You won't continue to be a king. And so Ahaz fails the test. He chooses not to trust God. He chooses to trust Assyria. And so God has asked Ahaz, how can God make you firm if you will not be firm in your own faith? And so chapters 7 through 12, the last ones we just looked at, list these failures of Ahaz to trust God and the implications of that failure. So the implications of those failures is worked out all the way from his own day, all the way to this time when this Messiah, when this person called Emmanuel will come. And he will be the true one. He will be the trusting one. He will be the faithful son of David. That's the same word for standing firm in faith, right? He will be the faithful son of David, unlike the son of David who's ruling right now, Ahaz. So what happens if you miss an exam at school? What happens when you miss an exam? Right? You have to go back. You have to study the material again and take the test again. And that's what happens in this next section, especially at the end of the section, in chapters 35 through 39. The next king after Ahaz is Hezekiah. And he takes the test, and he fails initially. But then he wants a do-over, and he studies again, and he cries out to God with Assyria literally on his doorstep, the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful empire, most powerful army in the world at this point, and they just decide to leave because they've had a huge defeat in a podunk backwater city in the middle of nowhere. The largest army in the world just gives up because God strikes them. Here, Hezekiah takes the test again, the test of faith here, and he passes because he relies on God. He trusts in God. And so that's what this next section is all about. Remember, Isaiah's big message is judgment. It is judgment. Israel lived during the last half of this divided kingdom, right? And Isaiah spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem. And more broadly, he spoke to the nation of Judah. He spoke, firstly, a message of God's judgment, right? When we read this, it's undeniable. There's judgment on every single page, almost, of Isaiah. He warned Israel's corrupt leaders that their rebellion against trusting God would come at a great cost to them. That God was going to use the great empires of their day to judge Judah and Jerusalem and Israel if they persisted in the oppression of the poor, of the widow, and of the orphan. These are all just placeholders for people who are lower in class than you. And if they persisted in idolatry. So, this announcement of judgment, though, every time in the book of Isaiah, every time throughout the whole book, announcements of judgment are contrasted with messages of hope. So Isaiah believes very deeply that God would one day fulfill all of his covenant promises, all the way back from Genesis chapter 12, when he makes that promise to Abraham that he would bless all nations through him. Right? That's a message of hope that Isaiah believed in. He believed deeply that God would fulfill those promises. And those promises are listed here on the scroll. We saw them in the video. I'm going to go over them one more time. That he would send a king from the line of David, from the seed of David. Next week's lesson is probably going to be over this seed language and how humans are often seen as trees. And the theme of trees and high places and different things in Isaiah and more broadly throughout especially the Hebrew Scriptures. Because what's the very first thing we see in Genesis? We see a garden with trees. We see people, and there's an interaction there. And where is this garden? The garden is on a mountaintop. We know this because there's rivers flowing out from it downhill. And so there's mountaintop imagery and trees and seeds throughout Isaiah, and I want to hit that next week. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit on a rabbit trail there. The hope of Isaiah, though, would be that he would send a king from the seed of David to establish God's kingdom. This was the promise that was made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David wanted to build God a house. God said, nope, but I will promise you this. There will always be one of your descendants on the throne. And ultimately, there will be this one seed that comes to sit on the throne forever. And so this Messiah, king, seed person would lead Israel into the obedience of that covenant that was made with Israel at Sinai. And all of this was so that God's blessing and salvation would flow outward from that people to all nations. That was the whole point of God choosing Israel, was so that they would be a representative to the nations, that they would be a nation of priests, not a nation with priests. They were to be a nation of priests. That's Genesis chapter 12 also, his promise to Abraham. And it was that hope, right, that compelled Isaiah to speak out against the corruption and the idolatry during the days of Israel, during his time in Israel. And so there's three main sections of this first part of the book that we're going to talk about. And they ultimately culminate in an event that's pointed to at the end of chapter 39, and that is exile into Babylon. The fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the people into Babylon. But within that message of judgment, of the fall of Jerusalem, is small glimpses of hope. And the end of the book, chapters 40 through 66 of Isaiah, really pick up that message of hope, and it paints this beautiful picture of a servant king who overcomes by suffering and service to God. And so there's judgment and hope for Jerusalem in the first 12 chapters, especially the hope, if you want to look, is in chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. This is just famous. It's just quoted so many times throughout the New Testament. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the future or latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established on the highest of mountains and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways. Teaching, that word teaching is the word Torah. That's what the word Torah is in Hebrew. It's teaching. It's not necessarily a book with 5 subheadings in it. And so this is the storyline of Old Jerusalem, that Old Jerusalem would rebel, would participate in idolatry, would participate in, especially in injustice, and that there would be a purifying fire so that a new Jerusalem could be built. This thing that's talked about here in chapter 2 that I just read about, that all nations would flow to. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That's the new Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations. He shall decide disputes for many peoples. That's the symbol of peace happening. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. This was the great hope of the United Nations after World War II, right? And after World War I, the League of Nations. In fact, this I showed a picture of it a few weeks ago. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. That is on the wall of the United Nations in New York. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This new Jerusalem would be characterized by justice and peace for all the nations, but not before there was a purifying judgment to happen. And that's going to happen on the nations around them, like we're going to go over this morning, but it's going to happen in Judah and Jerusalem also. And this is a repeated theme that happens over and over throughout the book. We have this picture of the lofty city of Jerusalem, of Babylon, of whatever the object is at the time, and that lofty city that is proud of itself will be brought down so that it could be purified, so that the evil of oppression, the evil people that are killing each other, that are murdering, that are bribing, that are doing all these evil things will then be purified out, and a new Jerusalem will appear that will be led by the one true king of Israel, the descendant of David, and it will be there forever. And it's getting filled in increasing detail every time it comes up. So, let's just skip that for right now. So, a series of oracles, chapter 13. Let's actually look at chapter 13 now. This is where we're going to start this morning. I'm not going to go verse by verse or anything like I sometimes do. I want to stay on the top level, the big picture here this morning. So we have a picture of judgment, excuse me, on the Mesopotamian powers. Now, Mesopotamia is that area of Iraq and Iran today, modern Iraq and Iran, and it's between the Tigris and Euphrates River. These were not really close neighbors to Israel. And so as we look at this, we need to see that this is a little bit bigger picture here that Isaiah is talking about. The word oracle here could be a pronouncement. If we look in different versions, I looked up different versions, and it uses the word oracles, it uses the word pronouncements, messages. The literal translation of this, if we're going to use literal, it's debatable, is burden. It's something that was put onto Isaiah to give against the nations. And so Isaiah puts his message to the nations right at the beginning of these lessons in trust. So we have these messages to Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, Moab. There's one more. Who am I missing? Well, if we get into 17, Damascus. But Ahaz trusted in these nations. He trusted in Assyria, his longtime enemy, right? And these oracles are against these nations. Isaiah's message is that they don't need to trust these alliances with these nations because these nations themselves are under judgment. And several of them will actually turn and worship your God if you will trust in him. Isaiah is saying, don't trust in them, trust in God. So beginning with chapters 13 and 14 here, Isaiah begins to talk about the downfall of Babylon, which is strange because at this point, Babylon is a backwater territory of no more than a couple cities at this point, right? Assyria is the dominant empire, and Babylon is this little city-state within the Assyrian empire, right? They're sort of subjugated. Babylon is not a threat to Jerusalem at this point. Assyria is the threat. Babylon, though, is a very wealthy province of the Assyrian Empire. And I think this is one of the things that Isaiah was getting at here, is that when we think we're doing well, and when we eventually overcome via our own military might and become prosperous, and we begin oppressing other people so that we can then become more prosperous, that this is a problem according to God. And in fact, if you read the first 16 verses, I mentioned this in class, if you read the first 16 verses of chapter 13, the only time Babylon is mentioned is right at the beginning of chapter 13. There's no geographical nation that's mentioned in those first 16 verses. The scale of the destruction here, though, is mentioned, and that is worldwide destruction, right? Verse 12 of chapter 13 of Isaiah. I will make the people more rare than gold. Of course, this is in the ESV. Let me read it from the NASB. Chapter 13 and verse 12. I will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, and mankind more scarce than the gold of Ophir. That's chapter 13, verse 12. Let me read verse 13. Therefore I shall make the heavens tremble. This is not just Babylon. This is the heavens tremble. And the earth will be shaken in its place, from its place, at the fury of the Lord of hosts, the Lord of armies, in the day of his burning anger. That's the day of the Lord. I think what's happening here is that Isaiah is introducing these chapters 13 through 23 here, with a universal statement of judgment. Before we get into individual nations, everybody, let me just say, everybody's under judgment here. This whole world is under God's judgment. And this is, I mentioned this during the Bible class, this is something we take for granted, right? That God is God over the world. Does anybody question whether he's not over Anchorage or anywhere else in the world? Like, he's not a local God. But that was a revolutionary thought during this time period. We say, of course that's the case, but that wasn't the case back in Isaiah's day. This is the equivalent of saying the God of Southeast Alaska here, of Baranof Island, is the God of the world. Because Baranof and all of Southeast, from Haines down all the way south, is about the same size as Israel was at its greatest extent, about 250 miles long. And saying to everybody in the whole world, you're going to have to stand before the God of Southeast Alaska. And he is going to deal out his justice. That would be a revolutionary thing for us to say. And for several hundred years in America here, let's bring this back now and make an application for us today. For several hundred years in America, it's been easy for us to say that our God is God of the world, because we've been a very blessed nation, whether it depends on how you look at that, but we've been blessed militarily, monetarily. We won several wars, right? It's been easy for us to say our God is God of the world and that the whole world will bow to him. But it's not my opinion. It's the fact of the direction of our country and the way it's going is that it's going to be much harder in the coming days when Christians are a small minority facing the Babylon of our own time like it is in England today. If you live in England, the vast majority of the population is atheist. Not just agnostic, but atheist. And so declaring that God is Lord in England can get you arrested. Like, it's already happening. And so the same thing is coming our way to our own country. And I'm not here as a doom and gloom type of guy. I'm just telling you the way history goes. Because humans make bad decisions and we are prideful individuals. God is not God over my life. I get to decide what I want to do, right? The lesson here is that God's destruction on human pride is universal. And he will use whatever means he feels like using to do that. Whether that's Assyria destroying Israel, whether that's Babylon destroying Assyria, whether that's Babylon destroying Judah, or whether that's one man destroying all of those systems through a sacrifice. So, pride. Let's talk about this word pride a little bit more, because what are some of the sins here of the judgment that's coming in chapter 13? And the sin, I believe, is in verse 11. Thus I will punish the world for its evil. Evil's kind of broad, right? Well, what is evil? For the wickedness of their iniquity. Iniquity is one of those, obsolete words that we don't have a good word for in modern English. It means that entangling sin. It's not just sin, but it's sin that entangles. It's a web of lies. The wickedness of their iniquity. I will also put an end to their arrogance of the proud, and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. Let me read that out of the ESV. Chapter 13, verse 11. Let me just read it. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pride of the ruthless. I will make them more rare than the gold of Ophir. Pride, arrogance, ruthlessness. But why are these singled out here and throughout the book? I want you to ask that question. Why is he so upset about these things? It's because pride is the root of all of the other sins that are mentioned, right? Pride is to say that I know better than God. And to go even further and to put into words our feelings like the Babylonian rulers did, like almost every ruler during this time did, and to believe that I am now God because I know better than God, that I should be like him, that I want other people to praise me. And so this view of ourselves is antithetical to the gospel of Christ, right? The gospel of Christ is that he came as a servant, a suffering servant. That sounds nothing like pride. Sounds nothing like forcing people to praise him. So remember chapter 6. We're talking about pride. What happens in chapter 6? Remember Isaiah's encounter with the great I am? Chapter 4. I'm in the wrong chapter. Give me 1 second. Isaiah, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the Yahweh of armies. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds trembled at the voice of him who called out, and while the temple was filling with smoke. And then I said, Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Yahweh of armies, the Lord of armies. And then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs. And he touched my mouth with it. And he said, Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sins are forgiven, are atoned for. Isaiah's encounter with this great exalted Yahweh, the Lord, in all capital letters here. That's his personal name. The YHWH is how you write it in English. That no human flesh can stand in his presence by ourselves. And Isaiah realizes that. I am a man of unclean lips. I'm about to be vaporized. But Isaiah isn't. He's cleansed. It's not because it's something that he did, was it? Without even asking for it, he's cleansed. And like Jerusalem, he is brought low in front of the God of the universe to become a servant of God. And this is the major theme of Isaiah, the prophet, is that prideful humanity, whether it's in the form of Jerusalem, whether it's in the form of Babylon, whether it's in the form of all humanity, has to be cleansed, has to be purified. That God, that Yahweh will not allow a prideful, oppressive, idolatrous nation to continue forever. So we ask, can I not be proud of my child for, his finger painting or whatever he did? Well, that's not the same thing. There's a difference between pride and self-respect. And the difference is that pride seeks to build you up from inside of yourself. That we view our own value as based on my own accomplishments. But the truth is that my own accomplishments are but dust in front of God. Right? Our self-respect is not derived from within ourselves. Our self-respect should be derived from a relationship with the great I am, with God. Right? Because he is our creator, he has determined our worth. Our worth isn't based on my actions and my accomplishments in my life. Right? Pride thinks that it accomplishes everything itself, but self-respect says that I am made in God's image, and therefore I have worth. That my worth is derived from God in my relationship with the Creator, not from what I have done. So the question is, how much are you worth? Are you worth the death of Christ? The answer is yes. The question is, will you accept it? So as we get into chapters 14, I'm just going to run through them real quick here. Chapters 14 through 16. I'm going to try and do it quickly, sorry. I think that Isaiah puts Babylon at the head of this list here of nations because Babylon is the glory of the nations. That's what they call themselves. What God is saying here is that what they have, what Babylon has, is not true glory. They do not have eternal significance. Babylon didn't last 200 years in their fullest form after they took over Assyria. Remember chapter 6 and the seraphim that are shouting, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." God is saying here through Isaiah that the glory of the nations is nothing. Chapter 13 and verse 9. "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate sinners from within it." Sorry, I was looking for verse 19. "And Babylon, the beauty of kingdoms, the glory of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." We still don't know where Sodom and Gomorrah is because it was such a great destruction. And so the fulfillment of the downfall of Babylon here is very striking. Did you know that the location of Babylon, the city, was unknown for over 1,500 years? Like they didn't rediscover where it existed until the late 1800s, right? That 200 years from the day that Isaiah lived, Babylon would grow to become the greatest nation on earth, only to be conquered by the Medes and the Persians within 100 years. And then disappear from the face of the earth for almost 2,000 years. And this is contrast with Israel's song over Babylon. This is coming up on chapter 14 now. That uses this reverse language. Isaiah reverses the language over lament for the king of Babylon's death, right? Chapter 14. In verse 4, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon and say, and then he gives these things that they're going to say. This poem here, and Isaiah is reversing this language. Or a king, you would lament over his death and say all these grand things. Isaiah is reversing those. Where it should read something like, "Oh, how sorry we are that you died," he says. "Sheol," that's the grave. "Sheol from beneath is excited to meet you." The grave is excited to meet you when you come. It's not to honor you, though. In verse 9, let me keep going. "It arouses for you the spirits of the dead, all the leaders of the earth. It raises all the kings of the nations from their thrones." These are the people that Babylon subjugated and killed. And they're all rising up to meet him. They're not going to rise to honor him. What are they going to do? "They will all respond to you and say, 'Even you have been made as weak as we.' Ha ha! You have become like us. Your pomp and music and your harps," this is a funeral procession, "have been brought down to Sheol. And when they pull back the sheet that's covering you, maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering." The people of the realm of dead are standing to meet the king, but this is not in an honorific sense. They stand to mock him. So let me get on a small rabbit trail here. This passage here in Isaiah, if we read verse 12, the very next verse. So we're taunting the king of Babylon, right? Somehow, some people got off on a rabbit trail and thought that when it talks about the downfall of this king, that this is somehow Satan falling from heaven. And they get that out of the next verse because the King James leaves the Latin translation of morning star in there, which is Lucifer. And so verse 12 says, "Oh, have you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn." King James says, "O Lucifer. You have been cut down to earth, you who have weakened the nations." I'm not saying it doesn't include Satan, but I'm saying that this is about the downfall of the proud. John Milton in the 1600s was the first person to claim that this was Satan. Like for thousands, 2,000 years, nobody thought this was Satan until John Milton wrote a poem claiming that it was. Satan is not Lucifer. What we have here is the fall of pride. And Satan is surely included in that fall of pride, but this passage is not about Satan. All right, let's keep going. So, God's message so far has been, don't trust the nations, don't trust humanity. And so in the last 2 chapters, we saw that Babylon was the overall symbol of human glory and splendor and power. But God said that Babylon would be thrown down to the ground and even further into the grave. From the lofty poetry of heaven, right, falling star from heaven, down to the grave of chapter 14, we now snap back to reality in chapter 15. And in the next 2 chapters, in the next 3 or 4 chapters, Isaiah is going to address the nations of Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Syria, Israel. And so Isaiah switched to this wide-angle lens now. Now we need to see the big picture. And now Isaiah is going to talk about individual nations that are a specific threat to Judah, but that also might make good allies against Assyria. You know, the Philistines had been subjugated by Ahaz. He could compel them to be his allies if he wanted to. And upon Ahaz's death, Isaiah warns Philistia not to celebrate because smoke or a fire from the north is coming. And that fire would be Assyria. Moving on, Moab is the next nation here in chapter 15 and 16, who has had this complicated relationship with Judah. We went over it in the class, so I won't go over it here again. Sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was mostly negative, though. And Moab is going to be destroyed. And so the prophet says that Judah shouldn't form an alliance with either of them because they're both going to be destroyed. So the picture being drawn here by Isaiah's poetic use of the city of Moab and these cities that are listed. If you read chapter 15, it's kind of hard to read because it's just a list of names and people moving from name to name to name. And it's kind of difficult, but the idea is that these names of cities are all from the north to the south, if you look at a map. So what's happening is Assyria is coming in and pushing these people south as they flee for their life as refugees. What I have on the board here is refugees during World War II. And this is some refugees that are fleeing from France during World War II. And you can see on the side of the road, you can't see it too clearly, probably on the board behind me, sorry. Projector's not the greatest, but you can see the ones, you can see them carrying their possessions as much as they can carry. And we can see that they're leaving behind them progressively more and more possessions that are just left by the side of the road as things become more frantic and frantic. Even as the remnant of Moab flees to the south, they are going to be eaten by the lion. It says in verse 15 and verse 9. There's a saying, it's very old, and I don't know if anybody here has heard it. There's no pockets in funeral shrouds. You can't take it with you when you die. And sometimes we forget in our lives because we spend all of our lives acquiring things. We spend our lives in acquisition mode. We're buying more toys and more tools than we'll ever be able to use in our lifetime. And I'm pointing to myself, all 5 fingers right here. In our nation, being relatively young comparatively to some of these nations, has been spared much of what the world has had to endure with refugee crisis and different things. Our nation has been spared in terms of death and destruction via war has been spared an immense amount. And for that, I'm very grateful. But ultimately, our wealth, Isaiah says, and our lives, they're fleeting. The harder we try to hold on to them, the quicker they fly away. And so in chapter 16, verse 4 through 5, let me read that. Isaiah's pointing to these people that are fleeing from Moab. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go? We need to remember in Isaiah's prophecies here, judgment is never the last word for the nations that he reads to, or that he's giving his prophecies to. Verse 4 through 5, let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. He's talking about you, Judah. Let them come to you. Be a shelter for them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then the throne will be established in chesed, in steadfast love, in loving kindness. And on that throne, it says, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and who seeks justice, who seeks mishpat. We talked about that previously. And is swift to do tzedakah, righteousness. The refugees from Moab will be begging help from you, Judah. Don't trust in their military ability. Trust God. The definition of that word, chesed, is the passionate, and let me just read it to you. The passionate, undying devotion and love of a superior to an inferior, especially when undeserved. There's not an English word. There's not a word in most languages that covers what this means. It's a very unique word. This is a self-giving love. Sometimes it's translated as mercy. Sometimes it's translated as sort of like a grace. This is a self-giving love that God has for us, that the Son of David, who comes in faithfulness, who is true to God, who is the true God with us, Emmanuel, right? That's what the word means. That this self-giving love is even more intensified here by the poetry, because the parallel is used in the next line here. This word, faithfulness. So, in Hebrew, you can conjugate verbs several different ways. He uses the same verb twice, just in a little different translation, in a little different conjugation, sorry. And so the next line, it's called parallelism in poetry. When you say the same thing, but it doesn't rhyme. And so what's happening here is this self-giving love is intensified because of the poetic structure here and because of the parallel that's used in that next line, that is faithfulness. It's also translated true, or being true to his nature. He will bring mishpat. He will bring justice. He will bring divine order. And there will be no more tears. There will be no more oppression. It will be a return to the mountain of Zion, a return to Eden. Because of the Messiah's mercy, because of his loving kindness, because of his faithfulness, his justice, his righteousness, oppression will not be able to coexist with him. He will offer a kind of security that will be more permanent than has ever been known. And so here's another way of expressing this truth here, that Moab is a representative of the nations. Think about it as me and you. That's us. And we will come to the mountain of God to learn his ways, ways which are incarnated, which are put into the person who is the true leader of Israel. And see, the key to coming to this mountain and being God's servant is being able to put your trust in him over the supposed strength of the people that are around you. And so this morning I would ask you, are you ready to trust the great I am? Are you ready to trust God, the Almighty, the Lord of hosts, Yahweh, all the different names that are used for him? Will you trust the one who brings judgment so that there will be a purifying, so that there will be a new Jerusalem? If you want to be a part of that family of God, we can help you with that this morning. If you're ready to make a change in your life, to be a part of the family of God, if you want to make that initial commitment and be purified, that can happen this morning. We can help you with that. If you want to send us an email, you can send it to us at sitkachurch@gmail.com. If you're here in town, please come, and we'd be happy to help you start down that road. That's the lesson from Isaiah 13 through 16. Next week, we'll look at chapter 17 through 20 or 21. Have a good morning, everyone.